A small brush fire near Sandy Avenue triggered a mass evacuation order for 37,000 people within just a few hours in Simi Valley, California. There was no long warning window, no gradual escalation. By the time emergency crews were fully mobilized, the fire had already expanded from 1 acre to over 1,300 acres, spreading rapidly across dry hillside terrain bordering residential neighborhoods. Major roads quickly became gridlocked as thousands of families were forced to leave immediately. Schools were shut down, students were evacuated by bus, and entire residential zones were placed under mandatory evacuation or warning orders almost simultaneously. What stands out is the speed of escalation. In roughly 5 hours, a minor ignition event turned into a large-scale wildfire with 0% containment, overwhelming initial suppression efforts. The fire burned in a critical wild-urban interface zone where suburban housing directly meets dry vegetation and steep slopes. This created a direct pathway for flames to move from open land into populated areas without natural barriers slowing the spread. At this stage, the question is no longer how the fire started. The real issue is how a single ignition point was able to escalate into a fast-moving emergency that displaced tens of thousands of people in a single afternoon. The incident began on the morning of May 18, 2026, in Simi Valley, Ventura County, northwest of Los Angeles. This is typically a quiet residential area, sitting at the edge of Southern California's dry hillside terrain, where suburban neighborhoods directly meet wildland vegetation. At first, nothing suggested a large-scale emergency. The fire was reported near Sandy Avenue, along the southern edge of the community close to the foothills. Around 10:50 in the morning, it was described as a small brush fire burning in dry vegetation. In those early moments, the footprint was minimal, roughly 1 acre. But the location was critical. This area sits inside a wildland-urban interface zone, where homes are built directly against slopes covered in dry grass, brush, and seasonal fuel buildup after months of limited rainfall. Conditions were already primed for rapid fire spread. The vegetation was dry, the terrain was uneven and elevated, and the boundary between nature and residential streets was almost seamless. At that stage, it still appeared to be a localized incident. No immediate signs indicated that this small ignition point would escalate into a fast-moving wildfire capable of triggering mass evacuations across the region within just a few hours. The shift from a small brush fire to a large-scale wildfire happened, with very little visible transition. What began as a localized ignition point started expanding at a pace that quickly outstripped initial expectations on the morning of the incident. By around 11:30 am, the fire had already grown to approximately 180 acres. Within less than an hour of being reported, it was no longer contained to a single patch of vegetation. Instead, it began moving along the dry hillside, following continuous fuel beds of grass and brush that had built up over months of limited rainfall. By early afternoon, around 1:53 p.m., the fire had surged to more than 720 acres. At this stage, firefighting resources were already being escalated, with air tankers and helicopters deployed to slow the spread from above. However, the fire continued advancing faster than ground crews could establish control lines. By evening, the situation had escalated further to over 1,364 acres, while containment remained at 0%. No stable perimeter had been established long enough to slow the progression of the flames. What made this phase critical was not just the final size but the speed of expansion. In roughly 5 hours, a seemingly minor ignition transformed into a major wildfire event, forcing emergency response systems into a reactive position rather than a controlled one. As the fire continued advancing across the dry hillside, emergency response agencies rapidly escalated their actions. Mandatory evacuation orders began rolling out across multiple residential zones located directly in the projected path of the flames. Within a very short time, approximately 37,000 people were either ordered to evacuate or placed under urgent evacuation warning. This was no longer a precautionary advisory. It became an immediate directive to leave as conditions deteriorated, and the threat boundary moved closer by the hour. Major roadways quickly reached capacity. Traffic built into long, continuous lines of vehicles moving away from the affected zones. Visibility in some areas began to decline as smoke drifted across neighborhoods, adding pressure to already congested evacuation routes. Inside residential streets, the atmosphere shifted rapidly. Doors closed in haste, cars were loaded with essential belongings, and families left with little certainty about when or if they would return. Everyday routines collapsed into urgency, replaced by a single objective: getting out before the fire advanced further. What stood out during this phase was the synchronization between fire behavior and human response. As the fire expanded in real time, evacuation orders expanded alongside it, pulling entire communities into a shared, time-sensitive escape in a single afternoon. Tens of thousands of residents were forced to make immediate decisions under escalating pressure from a fast-moving wildfire system. As the evacuation zones expanded, critical infrastructure across the region began shutting down almost in parallel with the spread of the fire. Schools were among the first systems to react, as safety protocols were activated for students and staff in affected and nearby areas. Several elementary schools in Simi Valley initiated emergency procedures, evacuating students by bus to safer locations before formal orders even fully caught up with the situation. In some cases, decisions were made locally, reflecting how quickly conditions were changing on the ground. Shortly after, entire school districts confirmed closures for the following day, effectively halting normal education operations across multiple zones. Campuses that were not directly in the fire path were still shut down due to access restrictions, smoke conditions, and uncertainty about fire movement. Beyond schools, other significant facilities were also impacted. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Library was evacuated and closed, not because it was directly threatened by flames, but because road closures and restricted access made safe entry and exit impossible. Emergency shelters were activated to support displaced families, while animal shelters and fairgrounds were designated for pets and livestock. These coordinated responses highlighted how quickly the situation expanded beyond a single fire zone into a regional disruption affecting education, transportation, and public services all at once. In the early hours of the investigation, authorities focused on the exact location where the fire first appeared near Sandy Avenue. Initial reports indicated that this was not an act of arson or intentional ignition. Instead, the most likely scenario points to an accidental mechanical spark during routine land clearing operations. A tractor working in the area is believed to have struck a rock or hard surface, producing a small spark in an environment filled with extremely dry vegetation. Under normal conditions, such a minor spark would not typically lead to a major incident. However, at the time, the surrounding landscape was highly vulnerable. Months of limited rainfall had left grass, brush, and accumulated plant material in an extremely dry and flammable state. The fire is believed to have started as a very small ignition point, barely noticeable in its earliest moments. But within a short period, it moved beyond the initial stage of containment and began spreading outward across the surrounding hillside. Although the official cause remains under investigation, early findings highlight a critical reality. In the right environmental conditions, even a brief and seemingly insignificant spark can become the starting point of a rapidly escalating wildfire event. What turned this incident from a small ignition into a fast-moving wildfire was not a single factor, but a combination of environmental conditions aligning at the same time. The first and most immediate driver was the fuel itself. After months of limited rainfall across Southern California, the vegetation in and around Simi Valley had become extremely dry. Its grass, brush, and accumulated plant material on the hillsides formed a continuous layer of highly flammable fuel. Once ignited, there was very little moisture in the environment to slow combustion or reduce intensity. The second factor was the terrain. The fire burned in a steep hillside environment, where elevation changes play a direct role in fire behavior. Flames moving uphill preheat the vegetation above them, making it easier for the fire to climb faster. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of upward spread, where each section of terrain becomes more vulnerable than the one below it. The third and highly critical element was wind. Offshore Santa Ana wind conditions pushed dry air across the region, lowering humidity and increasing fire intensity. In some areas, terrain-driven gusts accelerated airflow through valleys and ridges, helping the fire move unpredictably. These winds also increased the risk of embers being carried ahead of the main fire front, potentially igniting new spot fires at a distance. The fourth factor was the wildland-urban interface. Residential neighborhoods were built directly adjacent to natural vegetation zones, leaving no clear buffer between homes and flammable hillsides. This meant the fire did not need to travel far before threatening infrastructure and forcing evacuations. Individually, each condition would already increase fire risk, but together, they created a synchronized environment where a single ignition point could escalate rapidly into a large-scale emergency, overwhelming initial response efforts within hours. As the fire continued expanding across the hillsides, emergency response efforts intensified at full scale. Fire crews from Ventura County and surrounding regions were rapidly deployed to confront a situation that was evolving faster than initial containment strategies could keep up with. At the peak of the response, around 750 firefighters were assigned to the incident. Ground crews worked to establish control lines along the advancing edges of the fire, attempting to slow its spread through dry brush and uneven terrain. However, shifting wind conditions and steep slopes made direct containment extremely challenging. Air support was brought in as a critical component of the operation. Helicopters conducted repeated water drops, while air tankers released fire retardant over key sections of the blaze in an effort to create barriers and slow its forward momentum. These aerial operations became essential as ground access to certain zones was limited by terrain and fire intensity. Despite the scale of the response, containment remained at 0% for much of the incident's early phase. The fire continued to expand faster than suppression lines could be reinforced, forcing crews to constantly reposition and adapt in real time. What defined this stage was the imbalance between effort and control. Even with significant resources deployed, the fire behavior remained dominant, turning the situation into a continuous race between expansion and suppression. As the fire pushed deeper into residential adjacent zones, the first confirmed reports of structural damage began to emerge. By the evening update, at least one home had already been destroyed, marking the moment when the wildfire moved beyond open hillside terrain and directly impacted built infrastructure. In addition to the destroyed residents, several other structures and vehicles were reported damaged or burned as the fire crossed fragmented boundaries between wildland and suburban areas. The exact extent of losses remained unclear at that stage, as active flames and heavy smoke made full assessment difficult for emergency teams on the ground. What stood out in the early damage reports was not the scale of destruction, but how quickly it began. Within hours of ignition, the fire had already reached areas where homes and personal property were directly exposed to advancing flames and radiant heat. Despite the rapid escalation, no injuries had been officially reported at the time of the latest update. This provided a critical point of relief amid an otherwise unstable and fast-moving situation. Still, the situation remained highly fluid, with officials emphasizing that damage assessments were ongoing and conditions could continue to change as the fire front shifted throughout the region. As the situation stabilized temporarily due to weakening winds later in the evening, officials began placing the Sandy Fire into a broader historical and environmental context. While the incident had already triggered large-scale evacuations and early structural damage, it had not yet reached the catastrophic scale of California's most destructive wildfires. Previous events such as the Camp Fire in 2018, the Woolsey Fire, and more recent large-scale incidents in Southern California were referenced as benchmarks. Those fires resulted in entire communities being destroyed, massive acreage losses, and long-term displacement of residents. Compared to those disasters, the Sandy Fire was still in an earlier and less defined stage. However, what made the situation significant was not its final size, but its structure. The same combination of factors, dry vegetation, steep terrain, strong winds, and dense residential proximity, was present here as in past megafires. This overlap is what keeps emergency agencies on high alert, even when a fire has not yet reached historic proportions. By late evening, the fire had reached approximately 1,364 acres with 0% containment, and more than 37,000 residents had already been affected by evacuation orders or warnings. Even though growth slowed as winds eased, officials stressed that wildfire behavior in Southern California can shift rapidly again within hours if conditions change. The final message from responders was clear. This was not yet a statewide crisis, but it was a live example of how quickly one can develop. A single ignition, under the right conditions, it had already demonstrated the potential to escalate into a large-scale regional emergency in less than a day. Subscribe for real-time wildfire updates, breaking news, and critical alerts you won't want to miss.